Good morning, everyone. This is the IR cluster from Nickel and Dime, which is a research and publishing platform at the Center for New Economic Studies. And today we are gathered here because we're going to be discussing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In our last session, we discussed the Russian military buildup around the Ukrainian borders and how and whether that would lead to an invasion of any sorts. So today, since the situation has changed a lot, we're going to be looking into different aspects of the Russian invasion and how, the humanitarian aspect of it, or how the international community has reacted to such a large-scale invasion. Uh, we are here with our panelists. We have Shashank, we have Malika, we have Rushil and Nachiket, and Aishani. I'm going to be moderating the roundtable. So let's get started. Before we move on to the aspects of the invasion, I just want someone to volunteer to summarize the whole situation that has happened after 24th of February and how Russia invaded Ukraine. So does anyone want to volunteer? So basically, Russia moved into different parts of Ukraine, and there has been different reactions to the whole thing. But before we move on to the reactions, what do you think? What were the reasons? Why did Russia proceed with the invasion of that sort? Yeah, Rushil, and then Malik.
I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was actually kind of a series, a culmination of events, culmination of Russia's presence in Ukrainian matters since 2014 itself. And since 2014, through the annexation of Crimea, we can probably see a series of attacks. Some are proxy attacks, and some are small-scale attacks. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the end of the day, 2022, came down to the fact that NATO expansion was increasing at a rapid pace. And that was something that Moscow was threatened by. And Putin saw, in my opinion, Putin saw a gap in the power politics of EU because EU and the world in general, because the US, how do we say, the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan and the fact that China is rising at such a rapid race and how EU is power dependent on Russia itself. I believe Russia saw an opportunity to sort of take matters into their own hands and sort of build an axis, a Sino-Russian axis, and challenge US's authority. And yeah, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine was very symbolic of the times that we're living in and how we're moving towards more of a multipolar order and moving away from American hegemony as we knew it in an international order.
Okay. Malika?
I think even Nachiket had written an article about it, and it's where he described it's been a long time coming. This invasion has been a long time coming because the fact that they were upset about the USSR breaking up, and there's also been so much debate about the even Rushil said, the power politics have been changing, and it has put sort of immense pressure on Russia. COVID has also hit them hard. So when they take that into account, I think Putin felt a lot of pressure regarding those things, and which is why he took these steps and why he decided to take the invasion to the next step. But I feel like he kind of underestimated the politics taking that currently was in Ukraine too, and he thought that like they said, the historical unity that they have, that the Ukrainians will feel it and it will be like an easy invasion, like how Crimea was.
Yeah, I agree. I really think that the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine is a representation of the changing power politics. And as Rushil said, we're moving away from a US-led hegemonic order to, say, a multipolar order with many revisionist powers coming to play. Yes, Nachiket.
Yeah, I agree with everyone, but I think we should sort of shift from the realist perspective to maybe look at how constructivist tendencies have come into play, as in Russia and mostly it's heavily dominated by identity. What role does identity play in this crisis? Because as Malika pointed out, and I'll take that point forward, because according to the Russian mindset, according to Putin, he penned down his essay and he wrote in that Ukrainians are no people. For him, Ukrainians are no people. These were the frontier people who used to live in the frontiers and protect the Russian Empire, or the Russian Empire that has historically been there for like centuries. So that needs to be taken into account. That's the place from where Putin is coming. So I think this is not something that one can say is even an elitist point of view. This is more like a personal point of view, that there is a personal reinterpretation of history that Putin is taking. So I think I understand that there are realist power conditions. Countries do act in self-interest. They are rational actors, but we cannot just discount the constructivist perspective that it at the end of the day it's all about identity perception and identity protection.
That's actually a very good point. That's very insightful. Yes, Shashank.
Am I audible? Yeah, sorry. Just adding on to Nachiket's point on the identity crisis, and if you actually read his particular essay, he actually talks about, he gives this comparative example wherein he says, look at USA and Canada, wherein they have different countries. They are two sovereign different countries, but they live very close to each other. You cannot identify a Canadian from a Russian. There's free flow of trade, people, and everything. There's this unity bond. He even gives the example of Austrians and I think Swiss people. So it's that kind of comparative politics, and the way he defends the Ukrainian invasion through his arguments in his paper that really gives kind of solidity to his own claim, of course, which is a personal interpretation of his history, but which shouldn't be ignored as well when we are trying to look at the larger picture.
Yes, right. All right. So we'll move on from that. Like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's an event that hasn't really happened in a long time, especially in Europe. So the world has reacted quite differently to it. For instance, there's the West that's like condemning the Russia's actions. It's totally against it. Then we have certain countries like Iran, which actually blames the West for the NATO's expansion. And then we have countries like India and China who are taking sort of a neutral stance. So my question would be, do you think when it comes to taking stance on such events, morals and ethics or righteousness plays a part, or is it majorly just, how you want to conduct your relations with, say, other powers? Yeah, Malika, go ahead.
I would say it's about how they want to keep their relationship with the country. Because if you see India, for example, just being here, we have seen like how against violence we have tried to keep our nation for such a long time. So for them to try and so the stance of neutrality that India is taking right now, it's not condemning the violence, but neither is it like saying that it is right. And that stance is, and we can generally say that stance is because of we want to maintain, the government wants to maintain the relationship that with Russia that we currently have, which was, I would say, pretty good. It wasn't like fraught like we have seen. It wasn't a high tension like we have seen with China. It wasn't high tension like we've seen with Bhutan, and especially not Pakistan. So I think one neighboring country, such a powerful country, that too, such a large country, India is desperate to keep that relationship intact, or at least not sever it completely.
Yeah. Shashank?
Yeah, just drawing upon a recent argument given by Shekhar Gupta in the print. He argued that the stance that countries take in such situations of international crisis, it's nothing related with ethics and morality, and it's completely driven by self-interest, which is true if you even look at the historical arguments and the perspective. So if you see, in any of these circumstances, the stance that countries take, it always kind of, in the background, you could see that it's regarding their self-interest. And as like I said, the Indian abstaining from the UN voting is a clear reflection of India's dependence on Russian arms and things like that. So yeah, I would argue that the ethics and morality do not play a part, not only in the Ukrainian-Russian war, or is in any context. Even the Americans in another war, if if China was amassing its weapons near the Mexican border, I don't think US would take this morality standard and things like that. So it's completely driven by self-interest.
Yeah, Nachiket.
On this, I think I'd particularly like to agree with what Shashank was just saying, and adding on to it. I mean, there's an aspect of strategic ambiguity, and there's like more than like, I think, yeah, almost 5 decades of relationship that India has had with, officially at least, with Russia or the former Soviet Union. I mean, at that point of time, what was the consideration? India wanted arms, India wanted nuclear fuel, and I mean, there was nothing like nuclear suppliers group that existed back then. US could not have taken India anyhow, because US sided with Pakistan back then. So I think there's a history to that relationship, and that's why India would like to maintain that strategic ambiguity. Same went with crude oil. Why India is buying crude oil from Russian markets. So I think India is doing its best to, like, India is thinking of its people. There's no looming threat on us that, by siding on either of the sides. And I think, apart from that, US threats of US sanctions and US warnings, I don't think they can do it, because India is like, Indian Ocean is very critical to them. India is a part of the Quad agreement. So USA is really, I wouldn't say they're bluffing, because that would be like too lowly assessment of that situation. But I still think that uh, that it can be on that spectrum of bluff at somewhere.
Rushi?
Yeah, I think it's mostly realpolitik based. I mean, if you look at India's stance, for example, India is extremely dependent on hydrocarbons and arms for Russia, but also we're dependent upon West for our security purposes. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, we have a deep relationship with the US, and obviously Quad is reflective of that. And US and India share the same contempt for China itself. So India's example is very interesting because, of course, it's sort of a revision of Nehru's non-alignment in a certain sense, how we're going back to that era. Oh no, we've always been in that era, but it's a reflection of our old values and how we don't want to side with the particular dog in this fight, which makes complete sense to me. But I would also argue that for other parties in this game, it's also realpolitik based rather than virtue signaling and establishing yourself as a protector of democracy that US has claimed for so long. I feel like, as I talked about before, this rise of a multipolar order in an international system where no one's a clear leader, and has caused a lot of chaos and disruption. A lot of realists, such as Mearsheimer, and realists and liberal thinkers argue on this fact. And it's going to be an interesting time, considering how US's power is on the descent and China's power is on the rise, that such conflicts are going to arise, in my opinion, more and more. And yeah, it's all going to be realpolitik driven. I mean, it's going to be regarding virtue signaling and ethics, as you had asked.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly have to agree with all of you that India's stance of strategic ambiguity does make sense. And I also feel that the fact that India has kept a neutral stance, it has actually been able to mediate between the two parties to some extent, you know. So, all right, we'll move on. Regarding, how the West has reacted to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been economic sanctions against Russia. And this is not new, of course. So I would just like to, I would just want someone to summarize the sanctions, if they can just give a brief to our viewers about what the sanctions are about. And also, are these sanctions even effective? Like, if they are not effective, what is even the point of these sanctions? Yeah, Rushil.
Yeah, so the sanctions have basically been economic, and there have been economic sanctions. And one of the first sanctions that probably has done a lot of harm to Russian banks is their exclusion from the SWIFT banking system. So SWIFT is a transaction system that basically every bank uses for for the business, and Russian businesses have been excluded from that. If you look at another sanction, it's how the British sort of stopped sponsoring Aeroflot, which is the Russian airlines, and their airlines into their airports. So yeah, the sanctions are pretty wide-ranging, and they are honestly are effective, even though the ruble has sort of recovered most of its value. Those are short-term. Those are short-term solutions that we see currently, and how ruble has propped up its own value. Those are short-term solutions because in the long run, such sanctions are obviously gonna take effect and deal a quite permanent blow to the Russian economy. And the Russian economy is sort of very dependent on Chinese backing as of yet, because Russia themselves, although they are a great military power, economically wise, they're not doing so well. So the economic sanctions are sort of weapons of mass destruction economic wise, and those effects we're going to see pretty soon, I guess, as the invasion drags along.
Yes, Nachiket.
I think I agree with what Rushil said, but on a more theoretical level, also sanctions have generally been helpful as an internal deterrence of sort. Like countries usually are wary of sanctions, so they do not take particular action. So it was interesting to note that Russia would go ahead with sort of invading Ukraine because the same goes with China. Why it hasn't done since, because its economy is so integrated after the 1990s that China is also very wary of going and like it's not like they do not have the military capability. It's just like they just have to cross the Taiwan Strait and do it. So that analogy also holds. Why would Russia do it instead? Because Russia has been integrated into the economy before China. Because China sort of came into the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s. Russia has been there, like the shock therapy that Russia got to become a capitalist economy. After that, I do not think it's plausible for it would have been plausible for Russia to invade Ukraine. But since it went so, there's also change at a very theoretical level of how we think about sanctions.
Yes, Shashank.
Well, I would like to, it's a very difficult, really, the thin line whether the sanctions work or don't work. They don't work, in my opinion, they do not work in the short run, or rather, they don't really work when you want to really stop the country from invading it. Now that Russia has invaded, just putting those sanctions, which is quite heavy, of course, on Russia is not really going to stop the Russian invasion if that is the original plan. It will still carry on. And the timing that Putin has chosen, I think that was quite wise, at least from his point of view, when Europe is quite energy dependent on Russia, when you also have close to around 630, 650 billion foreign exchange reserve. This is probably one of the highest in the world. So he has that backing he would have expected the sanctions, of course. So he has some leverage to kind of carry on this invasion for some longer time. And I would say the sanctions only come into the effect in the longer run, wherein it just prevents another future attack of this kind. So because the Russian economy would eventually get hit, he would probably have to, suppose if he's planning a, say, future invasion to annex some other country as well, or rather capture or change the government or whatever it is, he would have to kind of now stall that plan for another, say, 5 years or 10 years, so that once again the economic recovery gives him that economic muscle power to once again push his way through. So yeah, I'm sorry. In the shorter run, it's not really going to do anything. Probably in the longer run, we just have to wait and watch.
Yeah, I do agree with all that you have said. And I also feel that apart from, them working in, say, the longer term, I feel they can actually have a negative effect on the country itself. And especially when we're talking about the civilians, because firstly, it does affect the civilians. Prices rise and everything. They are affected. And secondly, considering a country like Russia, it can actually move to being a closer economy, like a closed economy, and that not just closed economy but also closed country, and that will allow Russia to impose more repressive policies against its civilians. So I also feel that sanctions can help to some extent, but they can also have certain negative impact on the country and the civilians especially. um, Moving on, when you're talking about how the Russian invasion has affected the citizens and the civilians, there's definitely the refugee crisis. We cannot ignore the refugee crisis that has been brought about by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Like the UN Refugee Agency has said that around 10 million people have been displaced, and like it is one of the worst crises in recent history. So when there's a crisis of such sort, do you feel that other countries that may not be directly related to the crisis, do they also have like a responsibility to come to aid for the civilians, not just for their own citizens, such as India is evacuating its citizens, but just for the sake of helping the people who are not really responsible for any of this? Yes, Malika.
I think the responsibility, everybody has the responsibility for everybody is that to maintain humanity, is to just increase, you take civilized society forward. And that definitely comes in making sure that human rights of civilians, of people who are affected by a war, is maintained, that we are keeping those rights in check and we are upholding them. So I do think that everybody, not just, but everybody who is close by, everybody who can help, not just your own civilians, but as much as you can, as to what extent that you can lend a hand, you should.
Yeah, I agree. Nachike.
I think it's interesting to note that how the construction of the refugee as a in terms of race has been very, very crucial to understand why countries are sort of not helping others in this phenomenon. So refugees, like even Ukrainian citizens who are not from the dominant white race, have faced problems while moving to other European countries, neighboring countries. So I think there has been a hierarchization, and the construction of refugee as a human, like who is a human and who's not a human on a very theoretical level, is also understanding, because the idea of statehood inevitably works in tandem with the idea of being a human. And at the core of this idea of modern statehood, statelessness is often conflated with the state of being devoid of humanness. So if you're stateless, your construction as a human becomes very difficult, because that is how dominant frameworks, Eurocentric frameworks have worked, which becomes even more important for people from different races, because the whole argument about why is it happening in a civilized country also comes to play. Because so it's very interesting to note that the Ukrainian war has clearly illustrated the themes of racism at hand in multiple ways, and the most evident of this is the creation of the refugee in that sense.
Totally. Before we move on to Rishi, even I would like to just, highlight how race plays a role here, especially, the media bias that is very evident with, Western media portraying this as, this is something that has never happened in Europe. And how can this happen in Europe? This happens in Africa, the Middle East. It shows there's a very inherent bias against the third world countries that, wars and conflicts can only happen in these places and the West is only supposed to rescue them. So I do agree that race plays a really important role when it comes to portraying someone or something. Yes, Rushil.
Yeah, to your original question that whether countries have a responsibility in a Ukrainian in the invasion of Ukraine, of course they have a moral responsibility, sort of to take a side in that sense. But in terms of taking in refugees, I think it's sort of a win-win formula in my opinion. If you look at Poland, for example, there's been a lot of literature recently by the OECD, UNHCR, and all these organizations that sort of say that if you integrate the refugees into your economy well, it's a win-win formula because you have more flexibility in your labor workforce, and that is something which is quite essential for Europe itself, because no one wants to do the hard labor in Europe. No one wants to go to construction and all these sorts of fields, and these sorts of fields are dominated by refugees and sort of migrants in a certain sense. So as soon as refugees and migrants can be integrated into the economy, you can have more labor flexibility. You can have a better quality of life in a certain sense in Europe, because these are the guys who are building, who are doing all the hard manual labor in a certain sense. And it's not to say that they're relegated to these jobs only, but refugees and migrants typically have been an important source of labor market flexibility. And also, I believe on a more ethical or moral level, I think countries such as Poland really sort of showed what A lot of countries are into virtue signaling, but countries such as Poland have actually showed that virtue signaling doesn't matter in real politic basis. When something of an invasion happens, US is not coming clamoring to take all these refugees or helping them out. It's these countries who the burden falls on, and countries such as Poland have to step up. So yeah, it also establishes a deep fundamental flaw in NATO and all of these US-led multilaterals, where they promise and give you high hopes, but in the end they leave you dry and high.
Yeah, Shashank.
Building on the last point that Rushid said, it's kind of interesting to think and connect this with our earlier discussion when we said the stance of countries, is it morality or is it self-interest? But then we kind of agreed that, yeah, it's on the self-interest that the countries do. But when the topic now shifts to humanitarian crisis, it suddenly becomes a question of morality and ethics. And that's where he said that, the countries that's part of the EU, I mean, NATO as well, but who are not in the closer borders, they just like stand from afar, but just like kind of tell that, oh, you need to take in the refugees, that's morality and all, but why don't you take it? You also have the morality with you. So it's kind of funny in that sense. But at the same time, yeah, as I said, there's this dichotomy that exists between that morality as well as the stance that they take in. And inevitably, just tying it back to Rushil, the burden actually falls on the neighboring countries who have not only, if the neighboring country had actually abstained the vote or had voted for Russia, they wouldn't probably have the crisis. But if they had kind of voted for Ukraine, then they would be now here sort of coerced to take in the refugees just to solidify their position in the international stage.
Yes, Nachikeet.
Yeah, I agree with what was said, and I just like to add just two small points. So there's also been a problem with how the internal response of the Ukrainian administration has been towards the refugees. For instance, the internal response towards the refugee situation has also been constructed in accordance has not been constructed in accordance with it being perceived as a humanitarian crisis. For instance, the refusal by the Ukrainian army with respect to African women boarding trains in Kyiv, international students boarding train, or even colored citizens of Ukraine in that sense, has been very abysmal, because they were literally not allowed to board trains. White people were clearly given priority. And the second point that I would like to add is how this clearly also brings to the fore that our universalist and legal rationalistic definition of refugee has been challenged. So that definition needs to be problematized and challenged in order to understand what is this new definition of refugee, because the definition of refugee is someone who is fleeing from war, ethnic persecution, or natural disaster. But war, clearly the war is the case here, but the construction of the refugee has not been according to that rationalistic framework. It has been according to those Orientalist tropes of dangerous, like black and brown people are dangerous. So I just wanted to add that because it's interesting to look at it from the lens of Orientalism as well.
No, that is actually a really good point. I'm just adding on to the discussion about the whole refugee crisis and the role of other countries. As Shashank mentioned, the burden usually falls on the neighboring countries, and it's good to know that the European Union has actually stepped up, and it has passed. It is said that all the European Union countries, they will be taking in the refugees, and they'll also give them a right to stay and work there for 3 long years. So that's that, and let's move on to our last topic, which is how are things going to go ahead from here. Firstly, my first question is, what do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is it going to set a precedent for other revisionist powers such as, say, China, that it can pursue the same in Taiwan, or any other such revisionist powers that they can do the same and just get away with it? Yes, Malika.
This whole discourse about refugees and everything, and the color coming in, like talking about color, like race also, it shows that we saw what happened in Hong Kong, how much action was taken against China for what they did, for those atrocities. If China decides to go and take on Taiwan, of course there will be sanctions against them, and there will be uproar that how could you, how dare you. But it just goes to show, will the people of Taiwan even be seen as people who are in conflict? Like Nachiket said, this thing about statelessness. Do they even have a state? Because technically they are under China, so they should be Chinese citizens. So is that their state? Then that should be their state. Why are you fighting that you belong there? You're humanity. You're human in Taiwan under China. That becomes your legal parameter and the legal bounds that you live within. So for China, I think that the future for them is they will see the same thing, but it will not be at the extent and will not be at the same fury that is being thrown at Russia right now from at least Western countries.
Yeah, and actually that ties back to a discussion about the efficacy of economic sanctions as well. Someone mentioned that, the economic sanctions are effective in the sense that they can prevent or dissuade the same power from doing it, like from, then the country is not powerful enough to like undertake such an operation again. But what about the other parts? They can do that, and they are not really dissuaded by it. Rushil, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it opens the door for a lot of these future instances in a certain sense. It's kind of like a domino theory. Like if one domino falls, other dominoes are at the risk of falling as well. Yeah, clearly, in my opinion, I think this is an issue in the fact that we are in a transitional stage in our international, in our sort of currently we're in a transitional stage where there is no hegemon, where there is no unipolar power or a unipolar power taking charge in the international system. I think since we're going towards a multipolar era and a lot of countries are vying to establish dominance, you're going to see a lot of countries engaging in these acts to establish dominance and establish their aura as a great power. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is reminiscent of sort of these USSR times where they had this massive power and showed their industrial strength and whatnot. And China might want to do something like that. China can go back in the history books and say, you know what, Taiwan was a part, and which is something that they have claimed that Chinese Taipei, as they say, has been a part of our history. Hong Kong has been a part of our history, and we have the right to claim them back. And if they go with that line of thinking, they would like to showcase power. And in a certain sense, we also have to argue that what are the checks and balances for something like that to not happen? Because China is such a rising power and US's power is diminishing in a certain regard, then what are the checks and balances that can stop China? Is China also prone to sanctions? Well, they have propped up their economy quite well. Their economy and their growth rates have been stunning. So can sanctions work on them? That is something that is yet to be seen. As others have pointed out, they have been integrated in the free market. So theoretically, they should work. But yeah, it certainly opens the door for a lot of these conflicts, a lot of small scale conflicts as well. So yeah, because there is no protector in charge anymore, which the US was or what they claimed.
Yeah, that does make sense. And also, if you just talk about Europe, what about the other Eastern European countries? I feel that they are under a direct threat now. And what do you think that they should be doing? Should they like join the NATO, or what is it that they should do? Yes, Malika.
I think peace is a very fragile thing, and to vie for peace, joining something like NATO would, I think, it would have very depending on like how we see the way that the world is going, the way that the society that we are trying to create for ourselves, for the countries to like just merge into, like it will, I think the repercussions of that could be immense depending on the future of what it is. So I think that I do not know what they plan to do, but I do not think that joining a sort of war council would be the method to attain peace, or at least maintain peace.
Yeah, Nachiket.
Yeah, I think I agree with Malik, and again, the whole problem lies with NATO expansion. So it wouldn't make sense, because you see the sort of Balkan republics and like the influence in the influence in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, because these were the most recent NATO members in the early 2000s. So again, the problem is that bringing NATO in the immediate periphery of Russia is a big problem, because again, that is what Putin is wary of. So I think that doesn't seem like a very strategically calculated move.
Yeah, I agree. But then I also feel that Ukraine was not really a member of the NATO, and yet it was subjected to the Russian invasion. So this little, like, if for instance Ukraine was a member of the NATO, then the NATO members would have to, be directly involved in the conflict, and maybe Russia would not have invaded. Maybe there could, the whole thing about deterrence would have come into play, where Russia might not have invaded Ukraine because NATO members would have reacted differently. But I do agree that, if there are talks about NATO expansion, that can also lead to, again, the security threat that Russia, it just adds to the security threat. Coming back to the Russian invasion, what do you think is going to happen now? Like, the conflict is still very much there, and what do you think? How is it going to proceed? Is there going to be like a ceasefire or diplomatic effort to end it, or is Russia going to take over certain parts of Ukraine? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
I can't say for sure that I know. I've thought about what the end could look like, but it's very blurry, because the fact is, even if if Putin swallows down his pride and he does aim for a ceasefire and he does not apologize, but says that, yes, we were in the wrong, which I do not see happening. But it would, the sanctions, that the kind of, like I said, the fury that has been thrown at Russia for what they have done by the West, it is not going to dissipate so fast. It's not going to just suddenly just dissolve and it's going to be all right and it's going to go back to how things were. That anger and that sort of, like, like, how dare you like create a war type of situation in Europe? How dare you make 10 million people refugees? This has got so much of like media, like there's so much of media reportage and everything, like the world, not just Western countries, even Eastern countries, Middle East, the entire world is like, has the eyes on this, because like it has become an immense thing to see a war, like we said, that the way that Europe and the way that Western countries have like showcased themselves, have portrayed themselves as the saviors, and now they are the ones who have this massive conflict, the type of conflict that we only see in Middle Eastern countries or Asian countries, or like this thing, or like Afghanistan, or like African countries. So that it is going to change the perspective a lot of people have about different things. And I'm very interested to see like how it's going to go, because it's, like I said, it's all up in the air, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, Shashank.
So when it comes to this crisis, I think predicting is one of the most difficult jobs to do. We never predicted that they would attack on the 24th. They were like, oh, they're like keeping it over there. Probably not. They are not as stupid as we thought, but they did. And probably we did not think that the nuclear weapons would be kind of used, but he did put them on hold and he did announce it. So yeah, predicting is going to be very difficult. Yeah, but as we know, things have not really gone for according to plan for Russia. They did. They kind of expected the Crimean invasion, this the bloodless coup, just easily just go barge in and take it and overthrow the government and things like that. But they did not expect the resistance, the kind of resistance that have been offered by the Ukrainians. So yeah, I think it's going to be somewhat a ceasefire, somewhat an agreement going back to the diplomatic table. I mean, that's why I think they did meet in Istanbul to kind of have this peace talk and things like that. Probably, and I also read in the news that, or at least UK said that Russian troops have completely withdrawn from the northern border, which I don't know how true it is. But at least the most immediate effect that could happen is the Luhansk and Donetsk region, wherein that would be kind of probably declared independent or given some greater form of autonomy from the real Ukrainian government. So I think that's the most immediate effect that we could expect.
Yeah, those are some really good points. And as you said, prediction is like the most difficult thing. All right, so we've had a really fruitful discussion. We have discussed different aspects. We have discussed how the economic sanctions, they can be affected, but only to a certain extent. About how the position that countries take, they usually depend on power politics. But when it comes to humanitarian crisis, they can have a moral rationale, and also how India's role, we all have agreed that India's stance is reasonable, it's fair, it does make sense. And the way forward, nobody really knows. But one thing we know is that this is like a major event in history and can actually lead to a lot of consequences. So I would just like to thank you all for your participation and your effort, and we'll see you next time.